You're listening to Beyond Wellness Radio, bringing you the cutting edge in health, biohacking, and sports performance. Stay up to date and listen anywhere and anytime on your computer, tablet, or smartphone by subscribing on iTunes. Catch your host, Dr. Justin Marchegiani, as he answers your burning health questions as well as interviews from world-renowned guest experts. For more Beyond Wellness Radio, go to beyondwellnessradio.com.
Hey there, it's Dr. Justin Marchegiani. Welcome to Beyond Wellness Radio. Feel free and head over to beyondwellnessradio.com where you can access our full podcast transcriptions. While you're there, you can also sign up for our thyroid and female hormone video series. This series goes into the root cause of why your hormones are out of balance. While you're there, you can also schedule a functional medicine consult with Dr. Justin, myself, where we'll dig deeper into the root cause of your health challenges. Feel free and think of sharing this podcast with at least one person. This podcast grows by people sharing it. Sharing is caring. If you can think of one person that can benefit from this information, please feel free and share it. If you're enjoying the podcast, make sure you subscribe on iTunes. You can also click below the video or podcast where you'll see the iTunes review button and leave us a review. You can also sign up for the newsletter at beyondwellnessradio.com where you'll get updates before anyone else. Thank you so much and enjoy the show. Hey, it's Dr. J here. On the show today, we have Daniel Vitalis. Super excited about this interview. He's been on my books for a few months. And again, Daniel Vitalis is a writer, podcaster, public speaker, a lifestyle pioneer in the sphere of human health, personal development, and strategic living. Again, Daniel has a podcast over at Rewild Yourself podcast. He's the founder of Sir Thrival, and his website's also danielvitalis.com. Daniel, welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks so much, man. Good to be here with you.
Awesome. Very cool. So you're doing a lot of cool stuff, kind of getting people back to nature from a stress perspective as well as a movement perspective. Can you tell me maybe one or two biggest things that are on your radar screen right now?
Yeah, well, you know, what I think's going on right now is human beings are moving into this kind of transhuman dimension of living. We're kind of on the brink of so many unfolding technologies. And so we're seeing things like biotech and gene therapy and all of this sort of very technical medicine. It's all very exciting. Mm-hmm. And what's really on my radar is that I feel there needs to be voices out there that remind people very simply that we are a type of ape, that we're Homo sapiens, a species like all other species. And we need to remember as we move forward in this technological era to continue balancing in our biology and our zoology, because we can't, it's kind of obvious, I think, to a lot of us at this point, that the more technology we apply to our lives, the more suffering we seem to be creating in our lives. It never seems to end. It's always like we learn a new piece, we try to add in a new ingredient, and what happens is we imbalance something somewhere else. So I'm not saying we need to give up all this technology, and of course we're not going to, but I do like to remind people, hey, if we're a type of ape, maybe there's a lifestyle that we are really adapted to and have evolved in accordance with over the last 3.5 million years. And if so, we should try to bring as much of that into our lives, because otherwise, we're sort of fighting our own nature. And I think that's what we've been doing for the last 10,000 years, and I think it's had really deleterious effects. So, you know, rather than like, hey, here's the new hot ingredient, I really like to remind people, hey, let's bring in a little human zoology.
That makes so much sense. So let's say you're an executive, you're using your Wi-Fi, you're on your smartphone 24/7, right? What are some simple things you can do so you can still use your technology to get your work done, et cetera, but then you can still disconnect? How do you find the balance with the clients that you work with or people that you just see on the internet and such?
Well, you just brought up some interesting stuff. You know, you brought up Wi-Fi, you brought up phones, and these are really new devices in our lives, right? These are new technologies in our lives. And they are sort of habituating in the same way that maybe something like cocaine would be habituating or tobacco can be habituating. And you know, incidentally, I just want to be clear when I bring up those drugs, I really think there's a place for everything in our world, but things need to be moderated, right? Everything needs to be used in sort of moderation or else we abuse a tool. When it comes to things like our phone and our Wi-Fi, I think the best way to disconnect from it is actually to be able to choose times to disconnect from it. So when it comes to things like Wi-Fi, you know, we are adapted to the electromagnetic rhythms of our planet, and the electromagnetic rhythms of our Wi-Fi were not designed to be optimized synchronized with our biology. So it's important, I think, for instance, with that, like that at night, I recommend everybody unplug their Wi-Fi. When you go to sleep, like I don't see any reason to have that on. And same thing with our phones. Like I think those phones need to be switched off or to airplane mode when we go to sleep so that we're not receiving that constant bombardment of that electromagnetism. I think also for, you sort of mentioned, okay, you're the executive, you're interacting with these machines. I'm a big fan of the sort of blue blocker glass approach where you wear an orange tinted lens after sort of sunset so that you are not getting bombarded with that noonday light that comes out of our machines. And I love apps like, I don't know if I'm sure you're familiar by now with Flux, which changes our computer screens over to an orange hue after the sun sets in our environment so that we can keep ourselves on a circadian rhythm, because these technologies have taken us off of the planet's natural calendric cycle and put us on this very artificial given us an artificial circadian rhythm. Our body thinks it's noontime when we're looking at our computers, and it's important that we balance that stuff in our lives.
Totally. I had a doctor friend of mine just over at my house with a fancy $500 EMF detector meter. And we were literally just walking around my house seeing where Wi-Fi and Bluetooth and smart meters were really causing the EMF to jump up. And you want to keep it below 15 on the scale. And we're walking around and we went outside and we got in front of that smart meter. We saw things jump like 10 to 20 fold. Yeah. I went in front of my Nest meter, jumps up, went in front of my Bluetooth and the wireless routers and such, and it jumped up significantly. Now, I think exactly what you said. We got to turn off the Wi-Fi at night. One of the things I do is I sleep on a grounding mat. I have EMF filters in my room. I kind of have a couple of EMF harmonizers that I wear and put on my phone, put the phone in airplane mode, etc. But it's amazing. We're just walking around my house with this detector, and I could just see all these different things coming at me, and it was kind of eye-opening. Have you ever had that experience before?
Yeah, so I use a trimeter and bring that always to new environments and sort of like to check out, especially new appliances. And one of the things I think is important that we do is kind of, because we live in this world where so many of the technologies literally function on, to us, an invisible level, right? We don't see the electromagnetic radiation that comes off of these devices unless we have something like a meter, which allows us to sort of bring that into some kind of focus for ourselves. But I think it's important that we almost kind of give ourselves like an X-ray vision. Like imagine that you can see, once you've tested that, when I look at my Wi-Fi router, for instance, I can imagine that pulse of energy that comes off of it, and I can imagine where my meter starts to pick it up, so I can see sort of how big that field is. I can see that on my blender. I can see that on a ceiling fan. I think it's important that we imagine our devices as producing not just that invisible light, but a visible light, and we start to think about our proximity to them, especially throughout the day. And, for me at home, I do have a Wi-Fi router, but I rarely use it, actually. And I mainline my computers in with Ethernet because I like to just avoid having that signal altogether if I can. It's really important with our phones as well. And I think, obviously, your listeners know these aren't devices that were meant to be put, next to our gonads in our pocket or, in our chest pocket against our heart. All of these organs function off very delicate electromagnetic rhythms. And the reason, again, I want to be clear, the reason I say this stuff is not because I'm trying to it's because when we want to recreate a habitat that is similar to the one we are biologically adapted to. Right. And we are biologically adapted to the natural rhythms of the earth. So we want to try to maintain as much of that in our lives because we can't in one generation biologically catch up to all these new technologies in our environment. Right. So it's really important that we try to harmonize our environment with nature as much as we can. And that's not just on the electromagnetic level, that's on the atmospheric level, that's on the nutritional level, that's on the hydrological level. We want to make sure everything that we're putting into our bodies and bringing into our homes is compatible with our biology. And if we're not doing that, all the kind of latest, fanciest health trends aren't really going to help us if we're fundamentally battling our biology at the basic level in our own homes.
That totally makes sense. Now, regarding an EMF meter, do you have one that you recommend?
I like to use what's called a trimeter. It's fairly inexpensive. It has a really long battery life. You can pick one of these up on Amazon, and it allows you to see things electrically and magnetically, and also in the microwave frequency range as well, which is really helpful. So you can kind of switch from setting to setting, and it allows you to see some devices only show up in the magnetic range, some only show up in the electrical range, some only show up in the microwave range. So it helps us to see everything from our phones to our Wi-Fi routers to, big electromagnets that are in fans and other kind of whirling, spinning devices and such.
Is that the Tri-Field 100XC? Is that the one you're referring to?
That's the one.
Okay, it's about 119 on Amazon. The one I've been using is the HF35C. It's about 300. It was $500 last year. That's the one I use. But that's cool. Just give the listeners some options to check things out with. And then regarding outside of unplugging routers, do you recommend things like grounding mats? Do you recommend EMF harmonizers? Do you recommend EMF filters? Are those part of some things that you'd recommend to people who are exposed to these kind of technologies too?
Well, I think that it's important that we stay really sane and balanced with our approach in this. And here's what I mean by that. I have seen, and I'm sure you've seen, so many stickers and gadgets and widgets that have come out that make all these claims about how they balance EMFs or block EMFs.
Right.
I see constantly people go, oh, I put this device on my phone, it blocks the EMFs. And I go, if it blocked EMFs, you wouldn't get a phone call on this phone.
Exactly.
Right? Well, let's take out the meter and see what it's doing. Whether they harmonize it at some subtle level or not, I don't know, but I haven't seen any real data on that kind of thing that really convinces me that any of that's legit. That said, there are things that legitimately block it. For instance, like a silver mesh will block EMF, right? So if we took a silver mesh and we wrap it around our phone won't receive calls. That's truly blocking it. So there are things like that I like to bring into play. For instance, a piece of laminate that contains a silver mesh that blocks EMF, you can put that in your pocket and your phone on the other side of that, so there's a barrier between your body or in your backpack or your purse, wherever you carry that. And that'll still allow your phone to pick up signal on the other side away from your body. So those kind of devices make a lot of sense to me. But I think there's a lot of kind of hokey, fake stuff out there as well. So I think it's just we need to be really balanced with our choices around this stuff and make sure we're not buying into sort of hocus pocus. These are technologies, and we need real technologies that block, balance, and protect us from those things.
What do you think about a grounding mat, though?
Okay, I want to be delicate here in how I say this. I see grounding mats as having a place in our lives. I'm not a huge fan of some of the grounding sheets and things like that. And let me explain why that is. The grounding sheet, and this has been in my personal experience, and I want to say that I live out in the countryside in an environment where I can step outside naked every single day, and I don't have to be concerned with, I'm not on floor 42 of a high-rise apartment building living in all this kind of signals. But if you think about what a grounding sheet is, it's a sheet impregnated with a silver mesh. It's essentially a large mast antenna. So if we wrap ourselves in a mast antenna, that antenna is going to be picking up all the signals from everything in our environment. So, you could imagine essentially what you've done is wrapped yourself in something that's picking up the neighbor's Wi-Fi, it's picking up cell phone calls as they pass by, and all of that's being transmitted to your skin, which is in contact with that sheet, if you will. So for me, I have concerns about that. I think that that's a technology we need to be really thoughtful about. But that's different than, a pad that you walk by and touch from time to time to discharge static. So I know, and again, I don't live in a place where I'm constantly disconnected electrically. I live in a place where I'm very connected electrically, so I don't have to be as concerned about that. But I think we should be thoughtful with some of those technologies before we just jump kind of full speed into them.
Got it. And then what's your take on earthing versus like a grounding mat, so to speak? Obviously, you kind of have this bent maybe more towards earthing, getting out in nature, connecting with the ground, dispelling a lot of those positive ions. What's your take on that?
I think that even more beneficial than the discharge that happens is the electrical upcharge that happens when we're in contact with the earth. So, the thing that's happening when we're in contact with the earth is we're drawing free electrons up from the earth into ourselves. Now, when we talk about things like antioxidants, and I'm sure you know this from your background, essentially what we're talking about is something that can donate an electron. Right. When we talk about things that are toxic to us, almost always these are positively charged substances. So most toxic compounds can be adsorbed by the consumption of something like charcoal or clay. Why? Because those are electrically negative compounds, and the things that are poisonous to us are electropositive. We need as many electrons as we can get into our body to quell the oxidative fire, to stop free radical cascading. So when we are truly earthing, we're pulling free electrons into our body. It's basically like guzzling free antioxidants. So I think when we look at human biology, when we look at ourselves as an ape that has essentially 3.5 million years of human evolution, hominid evolution, we were in contact with the earth or grounded substances for most of that time. And only recently have we cut ourselves off from it. It's not just that we build up charge, it's that we are unplugged. Now, you see, like if you've got an iPhone, you see what happens after a day of using that phone and not plugging it in. It's like the battery dwindles down. And I think there's sort of something similar going on with us. Being barefoot on the earth is kind of like plugging yourself in to an electrical outlet and recharging yourself, as you will. But in this case, recharging yourself, well, I guess it's very similar. You're recharging yourself with electricity in the form of these free electrons.
Got it. That makes sense. So just to be clear to all the listeners that are trying to wrap their head around what we're saying, oxidation essentially is a loss of electrons, and stress and all these things that are happening, they're pulling away electrons from us, and antioxidants, they're helping to quench the loss of electrons. So when you're grounding or you're earthing, you're getting a whole bunch of electrons back into your body. Is that the whole idea? You're kind of giving yourself extra electrons so you're not losing them?
Yeah, and if you think about it, what's the process of living consumes electricity or electrons, right? It consumes electrons. And so we need to be recharged with electrons. Now, I like to sort of imagine, here's how I imagine in my sort of very simplistic rewilding approach to how I see the world. I imagine ourselves as being beings who consume the four elements, earth, water, air, and fire. What I mean is we consume earth as food, water as the water we drink, air as the air we breathe, and fire as the sunlight we absorb from the sun. Now, we need food that's fresh. And when I say fresh, I mean electron rich. Fresh food is full of electrons, right? When we preserve food, we lose electrons. When we eat fresh food, it's electron rich. When we drink fresh, moving, living water from, let's say, a spring or a good well, there's electrons in that water. And we lose that when water becomes still and stagnant. When we breathe fresh air, it has ions in it, electrons. So we get ions. So we get free electrons from earth, water, and air in our natural environment. And then we are charged by the sun, right, by the power of photonic energy. So we need that. And the challenge with our modern environment is that the food is dead and loses its electrical charge. Our water is dead and been laden with lots of sort of halide chemicals. We breathe air that's been through kind of recyclers. In other words, it's processed air.
Right.
And rather than getting fresh, real sunlight, photonic energy in its full spectrum from the sun, we've been living under really artificial light. So we've created something not dissimilar to a space station for ourselves. And the challenge is we've become like aliens to our own planetary landscape. And that's causing our health to suffer. And we run around going, oh my God, what's the cause of cancer and heart disease and diabetes and arthritis and all these things? And it's like, it's kind of obvious.
Yeah.
We're not living really on our planet anymore. We're living in a little virtual world we've created around our planet.
Right.
We didn't stop and think about making that harmonious with our biology.
Right. More negative charges, less positive charges. And again, all the things that you talked about, getting these electrons, and these are all negative charge compounds, right?
Yeah, exactly. And, it's funny because the wording almost, sounds backwards. Right?
I know, it sounds backwards, right?
It sounds backwards if you don't understand the electrical meaning of it. But once you do, I think of negativity almost like, and positive like male and negative like female. And I think of that female energy, that negative energy as like nurturing to us, right? Positive energy is more like the fire of oxidation, and negative energy is like that soothing, calming, nurturing feminine energy that comes in the form of those electrons. So yeah, we want to be finding those electrons in our food, in our water, and in our air. And if we don't have those present, we can kind of recreate some of that, right? We can find, like, we obviously don't get to eat out in our natural environment very much, but we can find fresh food at our farmers market, real fresh food from our local food shed. I have a website called findaspring.com, which directs people to springs in their area where they can go get living water from the earth for free.
Wow.
That they can gather and drink, and that is electron-rich, gaseous-rich water that's very different from the fluorinated, chloridated H2O that people are drinking. This is a rather lifeless water that most people are drinking. And we can bring, negative ions into our air at home by using good quality ionizers and by cleaning up our local atmosphere. So we can start to recreate healthy habitat in our personal lives. And I think that's a goal that the health world really needs to embrace, is the idea of, hey, if we're going to live in this artificial world, it should be more of a zoo and less of a factory farm.
Great.
Right? We're living in like a factory farm, and in factory farms, you don't care about the health of the animal long term because you're just going to kill it early anyway. In a zoo, you try to keep an animal as healthy as possible and recreate its natural habitat as much as you can. I think we can make this world a bit more like a zoo and a bit less like a factory farm for humans. And each one of us has to take responsibility for our own zoo habitat, our own personal habitat, or our homes and offices is another way to say that.
Got it. So getting out in nature is a big one. Let's kind of bring in the diet piece. You kind of talked about the caveman ape, and there's a lot of different biases in these topics. There's some people that say, hey, we evolved as vegetarians, etc. And there's some that talk about how animal products, collagen, colostrum, a lot of the bone marrows, some of the animal proteins, the omega-3 fats, these were really important to growing our brain, growing our frontal cortex, which helped us evolve into humans. Can you give us a perspective on the nutrition part of our evolution?
Sure, I'd love to. I'll give you my perspective. And, I spent many, many years chasing that dragon around, trying to figure that out. And it never occurred to me till just, 5 or 6 years ago, it really clicked. We already know the perfect human diet. We are acting like we don't because to look at what the truth of this is causes us to look at some things we're really shy about looking at. We don't like to consider ourselves. In fact, no, I don't know of any taxonomists except my good friend Arthur Haynes, who's been willing to look at this, that human beings have a wild form and we have a domesticated form. Just like dogs have a wild form, the gray wolf, and the domesticated form, those are our domesticated dogs. They all come from gray wolves. We all come from hunter-gatherers. We don't come from just hunters, and we don't come from just gatherers. We come from hunter-gatherers, omnivores.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
And we know that that's been our diet going back those 3.5 million years. We eat just about anything in our natural environment that can be rendered edible, be it plant, animal, fungi, or microbiota. So it's not just should we eat plants, should we eat animals? We also need fungus. We also need microbes in the form of fermented foods and things like that. So we actually eat from 4 kingdoms: animal, plant, fungi, microbiota, and we need to make sure those are all being balanced into our lives, just like the hunting and gathering peoples who are still alive today and the ones who were studied in the past before we pushed them to extinction or dispersion or integration. We know the natural human diet because we know what hunter-gatherers eat. Now, their diets vary around the world based on their location, and that's as it should be, but to act as if we don't know, like what the ideal diet is, or to make up diets, which is what we've been doing for a long time. We just keep making up diets. And they come in and out of fashion, and it's important for people to understand that it's very wise to step back and observe the dietary trend and avoid the fashion stuff. So it's like it's in fashion right now to eat a high-fat diet and a low-carb diet and to have lots of protein. But I remember when it was in fashion to have low fat and high carb. I remember when it was in fashion to have high protein. It keeps changing, right? They keep rearranging it's fashion. So step back from that and look at what hunter-gatherers ate and be careful of I think there's a lot of value in some of these modern trends like the paleo movement and the raw food movement. There's value there, but I think that we need to be careful not to develop diets based on caricatures of human beings. In other words, modern paleo is based on the caveman Flintstone caricature of human beings, and we never lived like that. That's ridiculous. We didn't grow up on Bronto burgers. We need to look at real hunter-gatherers in their natural environment and determine what they eat. And another cool thing when you look at hunter-gatherers is you'll see that men and women do eat slightly differently and do prefer slightly different things. For instance, when looking at the Hadza in Africa, we see that the women prefer berries more than they prefer meat, and men prefer meat more than they prefer berries, and that has to do with the natural division of labor. So women are spending their days foraging, men are spending their days hunting. This just makes sense.
Yep.
And what we do is we tend to try to imagine there's only one type of human, like some kind of ambiguously sexed, ambiguously raced human being. And the reality is we all come from different places, different adaptive backgrounds, we're different sexes, we're different people, and each person needs to fine-tune their diet to themselves and not get too wrapped up in these like very big blanket statements of nutrition. So I hope that's not too vague, but it's not so simple as often we want it to be, yet it's simpler than most people realize.
So in other words, we should eat meat and vegetables and maybe some fruit, and some of those ratios may differ for each person, right? It's kind of
yeah, it is. And then I'll add one piece to that, which is that it's important with animal foods that animal eats what it was developed around eating. So it's interesting that if we take a cow and we feed it grass, its body fat will be very healthy for us. It'll be rich in omega-3. But if we take that same cow and we feed it grain, its body fat will be rich in omega-6, and that's going to push us into imbalance. So there's one factor there. We want to make sure that the animal foods we eat are animals that were reared on grass or come from wild environments. When it comes to plants, we want to be thoughtful as well, because most of the plants we're eating are so hyper domesticated that their medicine component has been pushed way down, their nutrient component's been pushed way down, and their sugar component's been brought way up. Exactly. So in nature, of course, a blueberry is a very small, pea-sized, not very sweet, but incredibly nutritionally dense food, whereas a cultivated blueberry is the size of a marble, tastes like water, and has very little nutrition in it. So we want to be always thinking about animals that are closer to wild animals and foods that are more heirloom or closer to wild. That's going to really help us clean up that glycemic issue, and it's going to help us get more vitamins, more minerals, and more phytonutrients. That's why I always say, think of nutrition as a spectrum from you buy your food at Walmart to you're actually hunting and gathering everything. No one's going to really do that, but let's imagine that's the other extreme. We want to always be moving toward that, even if that we never get there. So maybe at first you go from Walmart food to, better supermarket food. From there, you go to completely organic food. From organic, you go toward that farmer's market food and start looking at heirloom stuff. From there, you start developing relationships with people in your food shed. And if you're real bold and adventurous, start going towards some herbalism, which puts wild foods back in your diet, towards some foraging and gathering, even if it's in your own backyard. And that always moves us in the direction of much, much better food. So I think it's about always having a locus of focus and moving toward that.
So tell me, what did you eat today? Or let's go through yesterday. What's your day like? What's breakfast, lunch, and dinner look like for you?
I like drinks in the morning, so I'm not huge about eating a big breakfast. So yesterday I had brewed a couple different mushrooms in the water from my well. So I brew those up. That was turkey tail mushrooms and chaga mushrooms, which I actually did gather from my own environment. Yeah, I had lots of vegetables from my farmer's market yesterday, which I, cooked down in some lard from a local farmer here. Big into saturated fats and think they're really important. I ate some local pastured eggs yesterday.
Nice.
This is going to sound weird to the listeners, but I cooked some dragonflies yesterday, which I caught in my house.
Wow.
Yeah, and that might sound crazy, but when you start to do the research on insects as food, it's like, oh, not only was that the past, it'll be the future too. I like to play with lots of different herbs, and so I worked with some different superfoods yesterday that a friend had brought over. So I like to think about food as I need my calories. Those are usually the fats that I eat. I got to get my calories in. I had also some bison yesterday as well. So that's like, there's the protein component. The insect was a protein component. The eggs were a protein component. Then I think about the medicine that I need, and that comes from my herbs. And one of the things we often forget, when Hippocrates said, let food be thy medicine, and medicine be thy food, he said it at a time where people had lots of fresh herbs in their diet.
Right.
And those herbs contain lots of medicinal compounds. The problem with the food in our supermarket today is the medicine has been bred out because medicine typically has a bitter flavor, and people are averse to bitter flavors often. So we've bred that out. And the problem is the food people eat today lacks medicine. And what they end up doing is becoming dependent on pharmaceuticals, because people do need medicine. We do need to take medicinal compounds. Without them in your diet, you become pretty hooked on pharmaceuticals. When they're in your diet in the form of a variety of good herbs, you don't need them as much. So I'm always trying to think about where's my calorie, my fuel coming from? Where are my antioxidants coming from? Where are my nutrients coming from? And where's my medicine coming from?
That makes sense. So you are kind of following a paleo template, so to speak, maybe adding in a little bit of extra stuff like the dragonflies. And I'd love to see that on your Surthrival site, little dragonfly protein powder. Sweet.
Yeah, I know, right? That's going to become a very big thing in the next decade. I mean, we are starting to see the early rumblings of that. But that is going to become a big thing. And what's really cool about insects, a couple things that are really cool about insects, I hope this isn't too weird for everybody, but when you cook a grasshopper, for instance, it turns red just like when you cook a lobster. That's the astaxanthin. That's a very powerful antioxidant.
Krill.
But with a lobster, you throw that away. You don't eat the shell. With a grasshopper, you eat that part, so you get all that. They're very high in protein, and they're also very high in omega-3 fats. They're a very ideal food source. But what's really interesting is when you look around the world, you find that hunting and gathering peoples, natural human beings living in the wild, always eat insects, always. Always. And we will start to again. They are much more efficient to grow than cows, than chickens. And soon we'll see a lot of this filtering in, and it already is starting to.
That's great. Now, in my functional medicine practice, I see a lot of chronic infections. And one of the things that I do to help boost the immune system, well, we'll try to knock out the infection, but I use a lot of medicinal mushrooms. I'm a huge fan of cordyceps or reishi mushroom, maitake, etc. And I see on your Surthrival site, you're really promoting a lot of different medicinal mushrooms. What's your take on medicinal mushrooms, and how do you apply that with your patients, clients, and yourself?
Okay, well, I really think, and I mentioned it before, that fungi are a really important part of every human diet. And we are kind of a mycophobic culture, or have been classically here in the West. And so up until recently, there were very few mushrooms in our diet because people are very afraid of mushrooms. And, when you go foraging with people, it's like, oh, berries, everyone's psyched. When you pick a mushroom, everybody's like, oh, be careful, because there are dangerous mushrooms in the environment. Yeah. But we've gone to the far extreme, and we got really afraid of them in our culture. Turns out, as you know, that mushrooms are incredibly important for up and down regulating our immune system. And what I love about, and I've fallen in love, incidentally, with chaga and reishi. They're my two favorite. They're the products that I carry on my website. On surthrival.com, I love the idea of the sophistication of the medicine that's available to us in the form of the sort of glyconutrients of mushrooms. And so what they're able to do, of course, is upregulate weak immune systems and downregulate autoimmune issues. Yeah. So they help to bring all immune systems into balance. There's no toxic dose. You can take as much as you want. The more the merrier. You can take them alone. You can mix them. I think that they're crucial to teaching our immune system about its environment. They basically educate, this sounds almost crazy, but the compounds in medicinal mushrooms educate our white blood cells on how to be better at what they do. And so I think this is really important, and it's why I mentioned yesterday that I started my day with a tea brewed from these mushrooms. Now, what I'm really into, and I think is really important for people who are using them, like you said, for infection, for other types of chronic illness, cancer treatments, things like that, is that they're using a dual extracted mushroom. And if you look at the mushrooms that I carry there on the site, you'll see that we extract them both in alcohol and in water, and then combine those. And that reason being, a water extract of mushrooms like these medicinal mushrooms, is very good for your immune system, but lacks the adaptogenic qualities. An alcohol extract has the adaptogenic qualities, but lacks the immune system component. So when we get a fully dual extracted mushroom product, we're activating the immune system the way we want to, and we're getting that component that helps our bodies become more adaptive to stress, and more tolerant to the stresses in our environment. And since the mushrooms contain both of those, we want to get both of those into any product that we're using.
Do you have your favorite mushroom that you use on a daily basis?
I would say chaga for me, which is a sclerotia of a fungus that grows on birch trees. And I've just literally fallen in love with this mushroom. And for 10 years, I've been a hunter of it and a collector of it, and I love to harvest it. And I also produce the product at Surthrival there with wild harvested mushrooms. So these are not ones grown in hoop houses or in sort of facilities. These are truly wild mushrooms. And that's important, by the way, because mushrooms that are grown indoors lack the density of medicinal compounds that we find in the wild form. But I'm a huge fan of chaga, and when it's brewed up, it tastes delicious. And one of the reasons is because it contains vanillic acid. So it almost has this, it's almost a maple vanilla flavor. And that product that you see there on Surthrival that you were just looking at, the taste of that product, it's almost like a coffee brandy or Kahlua or something like that. It's just delicious flavor. And you know how most of the medicinal mushrooms are quite bitter. And so I really like that. It doesn't have a mushroomy taste. It tastes quite sweet and delicious.
That's awesome. Most conventional vanilla flavorings actually from beaver's butt serum. You know that?
I love that. I love it.
Isn't that crazy? My favorite. Go ahead, yeah.
Okay. Oh, well, it used to be tonka bean, which was actually quite dangerous, right? So a lot of vanilla coming out of Mexico was tonka bean, which is really rich in coumarin. and can be dangerous for people on blood thinners and stuff. So I'm almost glad they've switched over in a way to beaver butt.
That just sounds crazy. My favorite medicinal mushroom is reishi. Reishi is the 10,000-year mushroom, just for the listeners. It has these compounds called triterpenes in them, which are really cool. They can deactivate viruses. And it's crazy. You don't see it in the literature in this country, but these mushrooms are used for first-line therapy with various cancers and even organ transplants. So many benefits. I think if mushrooms were really recognized for their true power, they could replace a lot of the medications that are used today for immune issues in conventional medicine.
I love reishi as well. I got to say, that's another one that I forage in my environment. It's one I'm super passionate about. It's the other mushroom that we carry at Survival. And as you mentioned, that triterpene complex that's in there is not soluble in water. So it's important that we have an alcohol extracted and water extracted reishi as well. But I mean, just an incredible, and one of the cool things about these medicinal mushrooms is it's not like we're just figuring this out. I mean, this is 5,000 years in China, right? They've known this. I mean, this is ancient knowledge finally being validated here in the West.
Totally. And I know on your site, you're a big fan of colostrum. Can you talk a little bit more about colostrum and its benefits?
Yeah, sure. Well, colostrum is amazing. I mean, this is something that's been looked at in over 5,000 studies. It is the first product that comes from the mammary gland of all mammals after they give birth. So before milk is produced, this is not a milk product. In fact, technically not really a dairy product, but the first product that comes through the breast from when a mammal breastfeeds its new young is colostrum. And this is how I like to imagine it. It's like when you're born, you're a blank hard drive. Your immune system is sort of kind of blank. And colostrum uploads the mother's immune system to you. It formats your disk, if you will. So when a human is born, now here's the thing about humans. We get a lot of immunity from our mother's umbilical cord, or from our umbilical cord from our mother. So she passes a lot of antibodies to us in that way. But colostrum sort of tops off our immune system. Now, if we were never breastfed, or if there was a delay in breastfeeding in the hospital, we likely didn't even ever get any colostrum. And that's why many people have such poor immune systems is one factor. Now with cows, the thing about cows is they pass nearly their entire immune system on through colostrum. So colostrum's super crucial for a calf. If a calf is born and doesn't get colostrum, it's not really going to be a viable animal for the farmer there who's raising that cow. So the colostrum is really crucial. But we've been breeding cows for 8,000 years, and they overproduce milk and they overproduce colostrum, and that's due to the way we bred them. So there's extra colostrum available from cows. So what we do is we harvest that colostrum in the first 6 hours, and 6-hour colostrum from cows contains all of the antibodies and a substance called transfer factor. And through some kind of really not well understood magic, essentially what happens is transfer factor transfers antibody immunity onto the drinker. And because we're both mammals, it works in us too. So there are studies on PubMed, for instance, that show drinking colostrum is 3 times more effective against flu than any vaccine. And that's really cool to me because we're talking about viral immunity here that can be passed on from drinking colostrum. But the other thing is colostrum contains all known mammalian growth factors. So it really helps with body regeneration for not just for athletes and bodybuilders who love it, but for anybody who's trying to regenerate tissue in their body. So it's really effective for that. And then one of the things I love about colostrum is that it's a supreme gut healer. And most of us need some regeneration to the lining of our gut. Very helpful for people with Crohn's and irritable bowel and all, the whole suite of intestinal disorders that are really common today. All those things are helpful. And another great thing about colostrum is since it's not really a dairy product, but something produced in the blood of the cow, people who are sensitive to casein and lactose are almost never going to be sensitive to colostrum. And so it works for just about everybody. And like I said, it's been looked at. I mean, we've been using colostrum as a species from cows for 8,000 years. And so there's quite a bit of research on this.
That's great. As a food. And you also mentioned some of the immune benefits of the placenta. Another great reason why you shouldn't cut the placental cord right away. Let that cord pulse. Make sure you get all the nutrients, all the clotting factors, all the good stuff from the mom into the baby. Don't cut that placental cord early.
Yeah, I love that idea. And I love when people, a lot of my friends who've had babies in the last couple of years have dried their placentas, ground them, and encapsulated them. And I just think this is a really important, again, it comes down to looking at what we did in nature and understanding that changing what we did in nature means changing something we've done for 3.5 million years, and that can be a really risky thing to do, because we've consumed, women have consumed their placentas as far back as we know, and the sudden change in that means a change in, I think one of the big factors is a change in the amount of progesterone that a woman ends up with in her body, because it's all in her placenta. Really important that women have babies in a way that's sort of in accordance with our biology.
Totally agree. All my patients, I recommend them having their placenta encapsulated. I've seen it made a huge difference on patients who had, the first 2 kids and had a lot of not PTSD, postpartum issues,
Right.
depression and such, and they do the placenta, and it's amazing that it's gone. And they just tell me it was the best, post-pregnancy period ever.
Yeah, that's what I always experience with people too.
Very cool. Now, what's your take on water filtration? Because you're drinking water from, your local well. Are you worried about fracking or underground GMOs or runoff pesticides getting into your well and contaminating it? How do you ensure that you're drinking clean water, even though it's from a well?
Right. Okay. So I want to just say that water is not the thing we always think it is, right? Mm-hmm. When we talk about water, we're not talking about H2O. And that's a really important thing for people to understand. H2O is a refined chemical that doesn't really exist in nature. Mm-hmm. H2O is a non-conductive substance. H2O does not conduct electricity. I mean, if we were, we think of water as like the conductor, right? Never get in the bathtub with an electrical device. You'll electrocute yourself. That's true. That's water. H2O, distilled water, doesn't really exist in nature because water is a solvent and it always draws things into itself, gases, minerals, things like that. Now, one of the challenges is we got taught about H2O and not about water, and we just assumed that it's all the same stuff. Well, the reality is distilled water, hyperfiltrated water that's been through reverse osmosis, which is a mechanical distillation, is water that's stripped down to almost pure H2O. It's non-conductive. It lacks gases. It lacks the microbes that should naturally be in water. It lacks the mineralogy of water. And so what we end up doing is drinking a kind of dead water. And I think we're going to start to see a lot of emerging science on this in the coming years. And people like Gerald Pollack are doing a lot of really interesting work on this. But that said, I think the healthiest water for us is whole water in the same way that the healthiest food for us is whole food. Now, people understand when you say, hey, whole food versus processed food, everybody gets that. There was a time when those were new terms and nobody knew what that meant yet. In the same way, there's whole water and there's processed water, and people don't yet get that, but people are starting to. So when I say processed water, I mean reverse osmosis filtration, I mean distillation, I mean UV treatments, I mean submicron filters. All of these things strip water down to its bare components, and nobody's really that good at putting water back together. Now, the water you drink becomes your blood. The water you drink becomes your lymph.
Yep.
This is really, really important that the water you're drinking is of high quality. When water comes out of a spring source in nature, it's rich in lots of substances, the local mineralogy, in other words, the electrolytes, and it's the electrolytes that make water conductive. These are charged particles, charged minerals. There are gases like carbonic acid, which has been dissolved into that water. That's really important for water to have a hydrating and flavorful component to it, right? So it doesn't feel dead or dry in your mouth. It feels wetter, if you will.
Right.
There are algae in naturally occurring water that actually can affect, and bacteria that can affect our mood, that can increase our serotonin levels. They occur in natural water. Now, I drink water from deep aquifers, and my well is a deep drilled well. So I'm tapped down into deep aquifers, and I'm in a place where there's not a lot of fracking happening. So I'm not super concerned about that here. My concern actually is more with processed water. So if we're going to the supermarket and we're buying distilled water in a plastic bottle, we're getting really toxic plastic-filled water. We're getting a dead water filled with plastic that we know is a xenoestrogen. If we're getting RO water from the supermarket, let's say we're going to one of those machines with the RO filter in it, the problem is we're getting water that's been stripped of its mineralogy, and that water is basically a diuretic and leaches from our body minerals. And we know that's true now, by the way. There are people who say that's not true. We know that's true. The World Health Organization has a fantastic living paper on this explaining sort of their concerns about the arterial damage that RO water does to people's bodies. and also some of the diuretic effects, which they're also very concerned about. So
I'm sorry to interrupt. Can we add some minerals back in? If we're trying to drink clean water, can we do a good quality sea salt and pepper some minerals back in there and such? Does that help mitigate some of the damage?
Okay, so yes and no. Let me kind of break that down for a second. If I don't think grains are a great food, but let's imagine for a second that we think whole wheat is a good food. Mm-hmm. Can I just take white flour and then add some, molasses to it and add some salt to it, minerals, and make white flour back into a whole grain? Not that easily, mm-hmm, right? Mm-hmm. It doesn't quite work that way. I can't just take, if I just take some water and some dried milk solids and some lactose, can I make milk again? Not that effectively. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So we think water is this really simple thing, but in fact, water is one of the most complex and misunderstood substances on our planet. And anybody who delves into this will quickly learn that. So to take water and just try to magically bring it back to natural living water that's been through the gigantic filter of the Earth's ecosystem is not that simple. And again, even the World Health Organization says that mineral injections do not effectively create natural spring water again. So that's one challenge. That said, is it better to do that than not? I think it is. And what I would recommend somebody do is get themselves a TDS meter, which is an inexpensive device, a total dissolved solid meter. When you get let's say you're drinking RO water, reverse osmosis water, check the mineralogy of that. So you stick your TDS meter in there and you go, okay, hey, my water's 5 parts per million. Then you take your minerals or your sea salt and you gently add those in, stirring them in until you get that water up to the minerality you want, maybe 150 parts per million, something like that. So you know that there are minerals back in there. But I do want to be clear. You've probably noticed this phenomena if you take good water and you leave it in a glass out in the sun for a little bit. You'll notice little bubbles form all over the side of the glass. That's actually the carbonation that's natural in that water leaving. And the water's going flat, just like if you did a soda or a beer and you leave it out long enough, it goes flat because the carbon dioxide leaves the water. Natural water is filled with gases, and those gases leave the longer that water's been out. So when I go gather water at my spring, it's filled with all these gases, and it gives a mouthfeel that's almost ecstatic. And when we don't have that, so we can add minerals back, but that doesn't put gases back. Now, there are devices like the Rewitalizer, which are cool, kind of almost like this interesting blender, which whips the water around over a mineral cube and will sort of recreate and restructure that water to some degree. But it's important that we understand that the best water in the world comes from ecosystems, and there's really no question about that. Maybe that's not realistic for everybody, but it's important that we do know, at least as a template, where the best stuff is. And the best stuff comes from springs, and they come from deep aquifers.
Got it. My father actually just emailed me an article last week by Dr. Pollack on structured water, and he talks about blending it up and how it affects the charge of the water. What's your take on Dr. Pollack's research and structured water, and should we put our water in a blender?
Well, it's interesting. I use a Vitamix blender, and I have for many years. And I do, if you have one of those blenders at home, I recommend you go up to it with your tri-field meter and see just how big of an electromagnetic field comes off of a blender. Anytime you've got a spinning motor like that, a ceiling fan, a window fan, a blender, you're going to get tremendous electromagnetic fields coming off of it when it's whirring and spinning. So is that ultimately the best thing? I don't know, but I think Pollack's work is amazing. I had him on my show. I love talking to him. He's a really profound dude, and the work he's doing is really important. And what he's showing and helping the world see, this has been known for some time, but it's not been validated in the past, is that water does have a structure. It's not just H2O. There's something far more complicated going on in here. And the water in our bodies is definitely not H2O. It's another structure entirely. He calls it a fourth phase of water. We are going to eventually dial this in and figure it out. And when we do, we're going to look back and go, oh my God, how did we survive the industrial age drinking dead water? I think structured water is really important. There's a lot of approaches right now. And the challenge, and the reason I'm very tentative about it, it's kind of like what we said earlier about cell phones. There are a lot of water structuring drops and little stickers that you put on your glass and all this stuff that don't really do anything. And then there are devices like the Vitalizer, which I think are legit. That might just work. That said, my personal approach is I go to springs, and so I'm not an expert on sort of remedying water. I'm more of an expert on where the best water is, and that's why I created findaspring.com, and that's why I've sent so many thousands of people out to natural springs. And I'm talking about springs you can drive your car up to, get out with your bottles, fill them up, bring them home. And since so many people now buy their water anyway, I think this is a really awesome alternative for people. I do think structured water is important, but I think that the water that comes from springs and deep wells is already structured, and the goal there is more about maintaining its structure. That said, if that's not water you have access to or aren't interested in accessing, I think looking at water structuring technologies is important, but be discerning.
Got it. So we talked a lot here the last 45 minutes to an hour. If you are a listener and you're trying to like fret out, what are the big take-home applications? What are the big three you'd say? If you could just summarize in 1 to 2 sentences each. All right, you listen to the podcast. What can I do now? What do you think those 3 would be?
Can I give 4?
Sure, 4.
All right, let's do 4. Okay, earth. It's really important that you eat the highest quality foods you have access to, and that you think about a spectrum of moving from the commercial industrial grade food that we grew up on, it's essentially human kibble, toward whole, fresh food with good genetics. It's not just the food's nutrition, it's its genetics. So moving toward that heirloom and wild food is always a good choice. When it comes to water, we want to be drinking the highest quality water we can. Most people are walking around sort of bags of dirty water. And if you're a fish tank, the food you put in the fish tank is less important than the water in the fish tank. So just think, the food you eat's important, the water might just be a little bit more important. So whatever your approach, drink the best water you can get access to. The air that you breathe is crucial. So make sure that you become the steward of the atmosphere in your home and in the place where you work. That I think the way to do that is to clean that air up with HEPA filtration, to have plants around, to have ions, make sure your windows are open whenever you can, recycle that air, don't bring outgassing products into your home, have the cleanest air that you can breathe. And then fire, get out into the light of the sun. There is no replacement for this. There are surrogates, of course, but there is no replacement for the natural light of the sun. It doesn't just help us produce vitamin D. It increases our serotonin levels. It helps to balance our circadian rhythm, helps to balance our sleep cycle, and nobody feels better than when they have a tan. So we need good quality earth, water, air, and fire. That's how we've adapted and evolved. And we got to make sure that we don't lose sight of that, chasing around a lot of products and fads when we don't really deal with the fundamental underlying stuff. And that's, again, earth, water, air, and fire.
Love it. And the last question I typically ask all my guests, if you were stuck on a desert island and you only could bring one herb, one supplement, one nutrient outside of, your food and water, what would that be?
I think it would be elk antler extract. If I could only bring one, because on that island, I think I could find most of what I want, I would bring the extract of elk antler, like the one that I carry on my website. I mean, I just think this is an incredible natural steroidal substance which youthens and strengthens and rebuilds the body. And that's kind of thing is not that easy to find in nature compared to, the kind of herbal medicines and nutrients that we're usually looking for.
And elk antler, the whole goal is to increase IGF-1 and growth hormone, right?
Right. It's actually an entire suite of growth hormones. It's 6 different types of collagen. It's a blood builder. It's stem cells. It's basically doing to you what it does to an elk, which makes new tissue grow incredibly rapidly.
And you can only find that on the elk antler.
You could find that on the growing antlers of any cervid. So it could be deer, it could be moose, it could be caribou, any of the animals that produce antlers. I like to work with elk in the United States, and that's why I say elk antler, and that's what my product is. But most desert islands don't have a cervid on them, and that's why I would choose that.
Very cool. Very cool. And everyone listening here, they can find Daniel Vitalis' work over at Sir Thrival, where he talked about some of the couple of products that he likes and recommends. His podcast, the Wild On, or what was the podcast?
It's Rewild Yourself podcast.
Rewild Yourself. And are there any other places that our listeners can find you, Daniel?
Sure. Go over to danielvitalis.com. There you'll find my blog. You'll find my free online magazine, Rewild Yourself. You'll find my podcast and, of course, links to everything that I do.
Daniel, it's great chatting with you.
Hey, thanks for having me on today.
Thank you.
Got a question for Dr. J? Go to BeyondWellnessRadio.com and click the questions button. Then tune in to hear the answer. Also, if you like the show, click below to review us on iTunes. For more Beyond Wellness Radio, go to BeyondWellnessRadio.com.